Hello again, feral friends and fellow nature nerds. Today's episode was inspired by a request I had from a resident at one of the facilities where I regularly do in-person programs. And as is so often the case, when I started doing some research, I learned some really super interesting things about these animals. And also, full disclosure, since I'd already done the research for the in-person program, it pretty much made sense to just roll that topic into a podcast episode too. So today we're going to be talking about llamas and alpacas. Now, these are domesticated animals, but kind of like the pigeons that I talked about a couple of episodes ago, llamas and alpacas have a long history with humans. But we're not just talking about llamas and alpacas. We're also going to talk about the wild cousins of llamas and alpacas, because those animals, the ones that llamas and alpacas were domesticated from, still exist in the wild. So without further ado, let's learn more about the heritage, the history, and the habits of llamas and alpacas. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, and this is the Dispatches from the Forest podcast. Okay, first, at least to start, I'm going to be using the word llama in kind of a generic sense. All the animals that I'm talking about today are related, and scientifically speaking, they're all some version of llama. The domestic llama is scientifically llama glama, llama with one L, which is fun to say and sounds like a llama that's dressed up for a fancy party, a llama glama. The domestic alpaca is scientifically Llama pacos. Likewise, the wild cousin to both these domesticated species are also scientifically llamas, but we'll get to them shortly. But before we get into specific species, let's talk about where all these llamas came from. Llamas, all the various llamas, are now South American natives, but it wasn't always so. In fact, the original ancient ancestors of all the llama species originated on the Great Plains of North America about 40 million years ago. They're most closely related to, any guesses? If you said camels, then you're correct. Look at a picture of a camel and a llama side by side, and you'll see the resemblance. That's right, we used to have camels, well, at least a camelid species, on the Great Plains. But that was before a time called the Great American Interchange. The Great American Interchange was a period of time roughly 3-ish million years ago. During that time, the volcanic Isthmus of Panama rose up from the sea floor, creating a land bridge between the previously separated continents of North and South America. Now, some animals had found a way to get over the water between the two continents previously, but with Panama now joining them, the result was an accelerated rate of migration from north to south and vice versa. Some of the animals whose ancestors came to North America included possums, parrots, armadillos, and porcupines. And in return, they got our camelids, saber-toothed cats, wolves, raccoons, and squirrels, just to name a few. By the end of the last ice age, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, the North American camelids were extinct. I mean, imagine how home on the range would have changed if they hadn't. Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the camelids and the antelope play. Doesn't have the same ring to it, but I digress. Meanwhile, down in South America, the camelids were still going strong. So let's take a look at the llama species that domestic llamas and alpacas are descended from, the ones that still roam free in South America. The parent species of the llama glama, the domesticated llama, is the llama guanaco, or simply the guanaco. Guanacos stand 3 to 4 feet tall, 1 to 1.3 meters at the shoulder. They're 6 to 7 feet long, or just over 2 meters, and weigh 200 to 300 pounds, or 90 to 140 kilograms, making them one of the largest land mammals native to South America today. The only other species that can match them in weight are tapirs, deer, spectacled bears, jaguars, and mountain lions. And speaking of jaguars and mountain lions, guanacos, well, all the llama species, have thick skin around their necks to help protect them from these predators like jaguars and mountain lions who tend to attack and go for the neck. but they can also run up to 40 miles an hour, an important ability for escaping predators since they live in the steppes, scrublands, and mountains where there's very little cover and no place to really hide. Guanacos are adapted to live at high altitudes, and they're found at elevations of up to 13,000 feet or 4,000 meters. To cope with the low oxygen conditions of this high altitude lifestyle, their blood contains about 4 times the number of red blood cells as the average human. In a parallel to their desert-dwelling camel cousins, some guanacos live in Chile's Atacama Desert, some parts of which haven't had rain in over 50 years. But they don't have a hump where they store water, so they have a different strategy. Mountains along the coast run parallel to the desert, creating what are called fog oases or lomas. When the cool ocean water comes in contact with the warmer land, the air above the desert cools, which creates fog and water vapor. Winds carry this fog across the desert where cacti catch the water droplets, and lichens clinging to the cacti soak it up like a sponge. Guanacos then eat these lichens and the cactus flower, getting the water that they need. Guanacos, like all the llamas, are social animals. They live in herds made up of females, their young, and a dominant male. Bachelor males form separate herds, and while reproductive groups tend to remain small, often containing no more than about 10 adults, bachelor herds can have as many as 50 males. Typical lifespan in the wild is about 25 years. Now, as of 2023, there were an estimated 2 million wild guanacos in South America, but it's important to understand that this is just a small fraction, somewhere between 3 and 7%, of what the guanaco population was before the arrival of Spanish conquistadors. So let's turn our attention to the parent species of the alpaca, Llama vicuña, or simply the vicuña. And since I have kids that grew up watching Dora the Explorer, every time I hear that, all I can hear is Dora saying, "Can you say vicuña?" Vicuñas are smaller than guanacos, standing about 3 feet tall at the shoulder, 5 feet long, and maxing out at about 150 pounds. They live in the central Andes at altitudes of 10,500 to nearly 16,000 feet, 3,200 to 4,800 meters in elevation. They feed in the daytime on the grassy plains of the Andes Mountains and spend the nights on the slopes. Now, behaviorally and socially, vicuñas are very similar to guanacos. They live in family-based groups of a male, 5 to 15 females and their young. Young males form bachelor groups, and young females form groups known as sororities. The wool of the vicuña is famous for its warmth and comparable to Angora or cashmere. The vicuña's thick, soft coat is made up of hollow, air-filled fibers with tiny scales that interlock, trapping warm air close to the body, which obviously helps them tolerate the kind of freezing temperatures that would be common at high altitudes. The challenge is that vicuñas only produce small amounts of this wool, and it's very expensive because not only do you have to catch a wild vicuña to shear it, a vicuña can only be shorn every 3 years. The Incas, the indigenous people of this area, valued vicuña highly for this wool, and during their reign, it was against the law for anyone but royalty to wear vicuña wool garments. It also meant that under Incan rule, vicuñas were protected by law. But after the fall of the Incan Empire and up until hunting was restricted in 1964, they were hunted heavily. When they were declared endangered in 1974, there were only about 6,000 left in the wild. As of 2020, the vicuña population has recovered to about 350,000, and they're no longer considered to be endangered. But staying that way will require active conservation programs to protect vicuña from poaching, habitat loss, and other threats. Now, given the value to the indigenous people of guanacos as both a source of meat and wool, plus the potential for use as a beast of burden, and the vicuña's value as a source of wool, domestication of these animals was almost a foregone conclusion. We know that llamas and alpacas were domesticated in the same way that all domesticated animals are domesticated, by selectively breeding their wild cousins. So, and this is a bit of a tangent, let's talk for a second about llama reproduction. Llama, again, in the general sense here, Because llamas have a somewhat unusual reproductive cycle for a large animal. First of all, female llamas are induced ovulators. They don't go into estrus or heat. There is not really a mating season. Instead, the mating comes first, and through mating, the female releases an egg, which is often fertilized on the first attempt. Secondly, llamas mate in what's called a cush or lying down position, similar to big cats and canines, which is also unusual in a large animal. And they mate for an extended period of time, 20 to 45 minutes, which is also unusual in a large animal, but it also may explain why they mate in the cush position. Gestation is about 11 and a half months, and usually a single offspring called a cria is born. That's C-R-I-A. Twins are uncommon, but they happen in about 1 in 1,000 births. Crias weigh 15 to 19 pounds and are born with all the herd's females gathering around to protect against the male llamas and potential predators. Most crias are born between 8 a.m. and noon, which sounds oddly specific, but it's during the warmer daylight hours, so in the wild this probably increases cria survival by reducing fatalities to hypothermia during those cold Andean mountain nights. Female llamas, incidentally called dams, don't lick off their babies, or more accurately, can't lick off their babies, because the way their tongue is attached, it doesn't reach out more than about a half an inch or 13 millimeters outside their mouth. But they do nuzzle and hum to their newborns. Crias are upstanding, walking, and attempting to suckle within an hour of birth. Llama milk is actually lower in fat and salt and higher in phosphorus and calcium than cow milk or goat milk. A female llama can only produce about a quarter cup or 60 millimeters of milk at a time, so the cria has to suckle frequently to get the nutrition it needs. 2 weeks after giving birth, the dam is generally receptive to breeding again. Okay, so anyways, the domestication of llamas and alpacas, all this selective breeding in the cush position, happened roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. It's been theorized that the switch from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle to widespread agriculture was only possible because of the use of llama dung as fertilizer. And it's also thought that the large number of llamas in the southern Peruvian highlands was a key factor in the rise of the Incan Empire. Until the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors, llamas were the only beast of burden that the Incas had, and many of the people that the Incans conquered had a history of llama herding. But to the indigenous people of South America, llamas and alpacas were more than just lowly farm animals to be used and slaughtered. In many ways, they were revered. Mummified llamas and alpacas have been found in southern Peru that date back 900 to 1,000 years. The Mochi people, who inhabited northern Peru from 100 to 800 AD, used llama and alpaca images in their art and included llamas, or at least llama parts, in the burials of important people as offerings or provisions for the afterlife. Likewise, Incan nobility were often buried with llama figures. Okay, so now the domesticated versions of guanacos and vicuñas, llamas and alpacas, can join the chat. Llamas are, of course, bigger than alpacas and can weigh 400 pounds or more, so a bit bigger than even their parent species, the guanaco, compared to the alpacas more vicuña-like 150 pounds. Now, I'm guessing that this reflects the fact that llamas were bred more for meat and to be used as a beast of burden or pack animal, where alpacas were bred for their wool, so size was less of a concern. As a pack animal, a llama can carry about 25 to 30% of its own body weight for 5 to 8 miles, or 8 to 13 kilometers. And perhaps partially as a reflection of their larger size, and also because of their social structure, they're considered to be very brave and aggressive towards predators, making them excellent livestock guardians, something I've mentioned before. If one llama notices a strange noise or feels threatened, they make an alarm call, alerting the rest of the group. And believe me, this sound will make you sit up and take notice. Using llamas as livestock guardians in North America started in the early 80s, and many sheep producers, particularly in the western United States, where larger predators like coyotes and dogs are present, have been using llamas successfully as livestock guardians. They're even used to guard their smaller cousins, the alpaca. Typically, a single castrated male is used, and research suggests that using multiple guard llamas is actually less effective than having just one. Multiple males tend to bond with each other rather than with the livestock they're supposed to be guarding. A 2-year-old castrated male will usually bond closely with its new charges and instinctively is very effective at preventing predation. Some llamas bond more quickly to sheep or goats if they're introduced just before lambing. Many sheep and goat producers have said that a special bond develops quickly between lambs and their guard llama, and the llama is particularly protective of the young lambs. Using llamas as livestock guardians has been proven to reduce losses to predation, and the value of the livestock saved every year exceeds the purchase and maintenance cost of the llama. So livestock guardian llamas are a viable, cost-effective, non-lethal alternative for reducing predation, which require no training and minimal care. Now, fleece made from alpaca wool, like that made from their vicuña ancestors before them, is soft and warm. It's also lightweight, flame, water, and odor resistant, and considered to be one of the most durable natural fibers in the world. But unlike their vicuña ancestors, alpacas can be sheared more often, once a year, which is usually done in the late spring to help them stay cooler in the summer. A single shearing usually nets 5 to 10 pounds of raw fiber, commercially worth anywhere from $50 to $200 a pound, depending on the color and quality. But here's something else. Alpacas, and vicuñas too, use a communal dung pile, someplace away from where they graze. In the wild, this might serve to limit the spread of internal parasites. Usually the dominant female approaches the dung pile to do her business, and the rest of the herd follows. But what this means is they're relatively easy to house train. A house alpaca? Yes please. But if there's something else that alpacas, and probably llamas even more so, are known for, it's spitting. But first let's talk about what they eat. Llamas, again in the general sense here, are herbivores, grazing on grasses, shrubs, herbs, lichens, fungi, cacti, and flowers. Food is swallowed with little chewing and first enters the forestomach to be digested slightly before rumination. This process is similar to that of ruminants, cattle, sheep, antelopes, deer, giraffe, and their relatives. But camels, including all the llamas, are not related to the ruminants. Ruminants have a 4-chambered stomach. Camels and camelids have 3. So this is a case of convergent evolution. The digestive system of the camel developed independently from the ruminants, evidenced by the fact that the forestomachs of camels have glands that the ruminants don't have. Now, when raised properly, a llama spitting at a human is actually a rare thing. So here's the deal. Llamas are very social herd animals, like I mentioned, and spitting is a way to discipline lower-ranked llamas. A llama's social rank in the herd is never static. They can always move up or down the social ladder, and they usually do so by picking small fights. And this usually happens between males to see who will become dominant. Visually, these fights are very dramatic, and they involve spitting, ramming each other with their chests, neck wrestling, and kicking, mainly to knock their opponent off balance. You might say that they're drama llamas. Females usually only spit to control other herd members, or when she's not interested in a male, for instance when she thinks she's already pregnant and doesn't feel like another 45-minute cush session. You can determine how irritated a llama is by the materials in the spit. The more irritated the llama, the further back into each of the 3 stomach compartments it tries to draw materials from. A little agitated, maybe only a little air and a little saliva. Pretty ticked off, a green grassy mix of acidic stomach contents. And just so you know, they can hawk that loogie up to 10 feet. So what does this all mean? Well, llamas that are well socialized and trained to halter and lead after weaning tend to be very friendly, curious, and pleasant to be around. But llamas that are bottle-fed or over-socialized and over-handled as youth will become extremely difficult to handle when mature because they treat humans like they're another llama, spitting, kicking, and neck wrestling. So the key apparently is making sure that they know that you are not, in fact, a llama. One last thing about llamas, doctors and researchers have determined that llamas have antibodies that are well suited to treat certain diseases, specifically respiratory diseases caused by coronaviruses like COVID-19. And with that, my feral friends, we're going to end all this llama drama. If you want to support the podcast, there are several ways to do that. First of all, don't forget to register for the first Feral Final Friday webinar. It's going to be January 31st at 11 a.m. Mountain Time. That's 10 in the West, 1 in the East. I'll be talking about one of my favorite topics, coyote myths. The registration fee is just $5, although you're certainly welcome to donate more. If you're a Patreon subscriber, you'll automatically get access to the webinar and a link to the recording afterwards. To become a Patreon subscriber, navigate yourself over to patreon.com/dispatchesfromtheforest. If you're not a Patreon subscriber, all you have to do is send me an email at dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com, letting me know that you're interested, and then use PayPal or the Cash App to pay the $5 registration fee. Everyone that registers will receive a link to the recording of the webinar, so even if you can't participate live, you can still register and get the recording. For the Cash App, use the hashtag ForestNerd. And again, for PayPal, use my email address, dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com. You can also use that email address to contact me for other stuff like questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes. Finally, check out the merch store at cafepress.com/shop/dispatchesfromtheforest. Click on products and you'll see all the fun stuff we have to offer over there. You can also follow Dispatches from the Forest on Instagram and Facebook. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to go outside and get dirty. The Dispatches from the Forest podcast is a production of Dispatches from the Forest. It may not be used or rebroadcast whole or in part without express written permission.